Brian. We are in for a real treat. Our final symposium session today is a fireside chat between two thought leaders covering a hugely important question for agriculture. What are some of the most promising and urgently needed technologies that analyze, address, and mitigate the impacts of climate change on farmers and food producers? Please join me in welcoming Brian Hallwheel, the Commercial Director of Belltown Farms and a Portfolio Manager at Astonor Ventures, and Bethany Wallace, the Executive Director of Northeast Organic Farming Association in New York State. And if you want to add a question or comment, you can do so by logging in to our attendee hub and selecting the chat room to the right of the viewing screen. Our in-person audience can also write their questions on the provided pieces of paper and hand them to our question moderator at the table by the stage. Welcome, Brian and Bethany.
Well, good evening, everyone. We're thrilled to be here and talk to you about climate change from our varying perspectives. My name is Bethany Wallace. I'm the Executive Director of NOFA New York. A little background about me. I grew up on a grazing dairy just north of here in Mexico, New York. Yes, there is a Mexico, New York, for those of you who don't know. I studied agricultural business and dairy science, and I found my way to NOFA about 16 years ago, first working as an educator and then an education program coordinator, and most recently as the executive director. For those of you who are not familiar with NOFA New York, we are an organization that is farmer-led. We do education, advocacy, and outreach on behalf of farmers. We also are the largest certification agency in New York State, so we're accredited by the NOP to provide organic certification. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Grow NY, for having me and everyone for attending. I'm Brian Hallwheel. My career in food and agriculture actually started out in media and journalism. I was one of the founders of the Edible Magazines Network in New York and had a very fun 10 years spreading, chronicling and celebrating why we should get to know where our food is grown and support our food producers in New York. It was a great, impactful business, but not a great business model. And about 5 years ago, I transitioned full-time to working with investors looking at food tech and ag tech innovations that could improve the way we eat and how we farm. And so now I work full-time with two funds, an organic farmland fund called Belltown Farms, where I manage our grain production in the Hudson Valley and Columbia County. And I also work with Astonor Ventures, which is an impact-focused ag tech and food tech fund. And one of the points I wanted to make, just transitioning into the conversation, is if you have been following the climate summit that's happening right now in Egypt, a really interesting statistic came out of it, is that all the nations at the summit, in their pledges to reduce their carbon emissions and their climate impact, they all mention their food and agriculture industry playing a major role in their commitments. And yet, those countries collectively invest just 3% of their climate finance in the food and agriculture industry. So we ask a lot of farmers, we ask a lot of the food industry, but we're really not investing in reducing their climate impact or offering them tools for adaptation and mitigation.
And equally, as we're talking about the farming community, we just want to recognize that farmers at this time especially are up against a tremendous number of barriers that they're facing every day to stay in business. Outside of trying to address climate change, they're also dealing with inflation, pay prices that are not meeting their needs, and really just trying to navigate to stay in business at this time, and we just wanted to name that.
And big picture, if I were to think about what sorts of innovations I look at as an investor, which can help farmers and food businesses reduce their climate impact, I'll often say that the innovations, those startups, they need to lead with agronomy. First and foremost, they need to offer farmers some return that's going to have agronomic benefits, that's going to increase yields, reduce costs, reduce input use, smooth the predictability of their production, and then hopefully as a benefit, it's increasing organic matter in the soil, allowing them to store additional carbon, maybe reducing their climate vulnerability. So when we think about ag tech innovations that can help us deal with climate change, it's important that these innovations are first and foremost accessible, affordable, that they're relatively plug and play. They don't require the farmer to completely change their cropping system or the way they operate their farm. And there are some great innovations out there that meet those criteria, but that's really for me, that's the first thing that we're looking for. Because if they're not accessible to the farmer in that way, they're not likely to get any traction with their main customer.
I really appreciate that you brought up the notion of accessibility and also the fact that you talked about agronomy. I think oftentimes people look at the organic and sustainable agricultural platform for the things that we don't allow in organic production, but truly what attracted me most to organic agriculture was the foundation of soil health as a pillar in the community, and really being able to look at what our environmental impacts are as we are farming. And NOFA New York especially is known for farmer-to-farmer-led education, so really focusing on what a farmer needs, really elevating farmers as experts in the field and really getting their input and having sound science behind the innovations that are coming before us that really are involving farmers in the process.
Have you, in your work with NOFA New York, are there big picture innovations? Is there technology adoption that you've seen among your members that you're excited about?
Yeah, certainly. I think it varies. Of course, we all know that every farm has a unique circumstance and really unique opportunities, and oftentimes because organic farms are small-scale farms, they think that like innovation misses those producers, but we definitely have small-scale organic farms that have put robots on their dairies. You know, we have a lot of farmers that are connecting with marketing platforms and using things that are scalable to help elevate their sales and ease their management on farm.
So with that in mind, we were speaking before, there's no real silver bullet solution that we can propose for farmers that will help them deal with climate change. Of course, farms are diverse, and helping them adapt to climate change is quite a challenge. But one big picture principle that I often think about is how can a farm incorporate additional diversity? And that's diversity in their business model, diversity in their farm landscape, diversity in terms of their customers, their crop mix, the products they sell. And so some of the innovations that I've been excited about, and I've seen good traction among farmers, and I feel like there aren't enough startups promoting and encouraging these sorts of innovations, are cover crop adoption, making it easier for farmers to work cover cropping into their rotation. So essentially, you know, when they're done with their commercial crop, their main crop getting something else on the soil, which has all sorts of benefits in terms of reducing future fertilizer use, holding water, improving soil health in general, but giving farmers the tools that they can realize that cover crops are not just a cost, that there are some long-term benefits. Along those same lines of increasing diversity, I've seen a number of startups that are beginning to encourage agroforestry and working trees into the landscape of various farms. There's an interesting company based in New York called Propagate Ventures, which is a venture-backed agroforestry service firm. So they'll basically come to your farm, assess your landscape, and give you an agroforestry business model to layer agroforestry on top of your existing dairy or veggie production, with the notion that you need to make money off of those trees. And they also have a financing arm, so they'll also finance the purchase and planting of those trees, and then you either split the profits with them or you ultimately pay them back and you keep the profits. So I found that's quite interesting. And then finally, in terms of diversification, I've seen a number of dairies in Columbia County where I work look at ways that they can diversify their customers. So if the vast majority of their fields are growing silage corn or hay or other feed for cows, they may consider experimenting with 50 acres or a couple of hundred acres as a grain crop. Maybe growing soy for grain or for the food market, or oats or wheat, and that was particularly popular in the last couple of years as we saw a spike in grain prices. And then that allows them to diversify their operation, hedge a little bit against a downturn in the dairy industry, and maybe they decide they really like growing grain, and that becomes a growing part of their business and allows them to diversify their business model. So those are a few of the big picture innovations that I've been seeing.
Yeah, and I love that you talk about having a diversified farm and really having a holistic farm approach, but also recognizing that every farm can't do everything, right? And so as farms are moving forward, we're starting to see a lot of collaborative models, cooperative initiatives where farms are coming together and recognizing the value of all of the different items that they have for sale and being able to market those things jointly and working towards having more of a community-minded approach in agriculture. And I think making sure that when we're talking about tech innovations, that we're not just putting the burden onto the farmer, but also talking about what is needed for those marketing opportunities, what is needed from start to finish to get products to market, so that we're also having an impact on climate when it comes to processing, transportation, and marketing of products that farmers are making.
Yeah, good point. And it's, we're focused on climate right now in this conversation, but it's really not just a climate challenge that farmers and the food system are facing. It's sort of, what we learned in the last few years in particular was that we had a very fragile food system, dependent on cheap energy, on very low input costs and free trade around the globe, and finally on a stable climate. And so adaptations that will help us deal with climate variability often will also help us deal with those other vulnerabilities. How can we make our farms less dependent on cheap fuel, less dependent on inputs that may not always be around? And again, it gets back to that diversification at every level. And that same diversity at the farm, the good news is that diversity at the farm ends up bubbling up and meaning more diversity in our diet. So if the whole landscape of Columbia County is mostly growing dairy feed, that means that there's not a lot of crops being grown locally for human consumption. So diversifying that a little bit means that what's available to the local diet is more diverse, not just the farmer's business model.
Yeah, and interestingly, like within the organic market, we saw during the pandemic, because so much of our farmers' marketing was direct to consumer, they were able to more easily pivot and be able to keep goods flowing in a stronger way. And we saw that especially in the dairy industry because of the bottlenecks that happened within processing and institutional packaging, where the organic industry had more single-serve packaging and packaging for consumer base. So like just thinking about how we make sure that New York State has everything it needs for folks to be successful, for sure. And kind of circling back a little bit more to the climate conversation, thinking about how information is being distributed to farmers and what research is being done. We recognize that we really need sound science behind these innovations and making sure that public funding does support research and engages farmers in that research to make sure that those innovations that are brought forward to impact production methods have good science behind them, for sure.
Yes, good science behind them and a farmer-first approach. I mean, the ag tech companies that I've looked at that have gotten good traction, that have had success, are ones that have a big network of farmers available to test their products, to give them feedback. Because again, if that farmer input is not involved at every stage, they're really not likely to have that sort of success. I mean, we for the last few years, we've talked about ag tech really being at like the first inning in terms of investor interest. The food and agriculture world in general has been very new to traditional investors, and so food tech firms, ag tech firms are relatively young. But if you think about investment in regenerative agriculture or climate smart agriculture, that's even earlier. So we still need lots of additional investment and lots of innovation to make more tools available to farmers.
Yeah, but something that we're really fortunate to have on our side, especially in New York, is a long history of farmers that have been farming with those methods, that have seen vast improvements in the landscape on their farms. And so being able to really tap into that resource, understand what has made the largest impact the quickest for those farmers and what they need to be able to take that impact to the next level. I think we're really well positioned with the number of farms that we have.
Yeah, that's a point worth making, that we already have good science from many long-term studies that there are types of farms that have less of an impact on the climate. I mean, organic as a broad category, because it's using fewer chemical inputs, fewer energy-intensive inputs, because there's a greater diversity of crops, because there's more emphasis on building healthy soils. Organic farms do have lower climate burden, and I would say ecologically managed farms across the board are also a good role model in that case.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot of opportunity. We see so many people, as you mentioned, like adapting cover crop practices, really looking at soil microbiology and understanding more where carbon is truly sequestered in soil and what initiatives we need to take, but making sure that farmers have access not only to the information and the education that supports those practices, but also the infrastructure that's needed to implement those changes on the farm easily and economically.
And one other sort of news item that we haven't discussed is the recent climate bill that was passed by the administration that created all sorts of new incentives for carbon storage, rewarding climate smart practices. And we're just beginning to see all of that funding filter down to farmers. And paying farmers for storing carbon is just one idea, but a big picture strategy of that climate bill, of the IRA bill, is to reward farmers for ecosystem services. So incorporating wild areas on the farm and conserving and maintaining those areas. Yes, greater adoption of cover cropping, which we know also has climate benefits. But beyond just paying farmers for storing carbon, which is still a little bit of a Wild West in a developing market, it does seem like all of a sudden there's some very big government backing that could filter down to farmers and encourage and support these sorts of behaviors. Because as you mentioned at the very beginning, the typical farm structure is fairly low margin. There's not a lot of room for radically changing the business model. Changes are made on sort of a seasonal or annual basis, not on a week-to-week basis. So it would be foolish to think we we can expect all these changes from farmers without supporting them and without creating some economic incentives.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the recognition for ecosystem services is important, and I think that everyone is, you know, in New York, we're well positioned, right, for a future because of our proximity to fresh water, because of our landscape, and because of our ability to grow good food. So what are we doing and what are we putting in place to really protect those natural resources as we see where agricultural production may shift moving forward? And also, you know, how are we supporting our farms to be profitable throughout that? Yeah, but first and foremost, making sure that we're protecting our landscape.
Should we take some questions?
I think we
if there
certainly
are.
could.
Sure. I can get us started. Hi. We have a question from our online audience to get us started. As a farmer and an investor, what do you think are the most effective ways for idea stage entrepreneurs to get their ideas out there to the ag community for feedback?
Very good question. I think at the early stage, it's important for an ag startup to have some farms and farmers where they can trial their technology or their service. So pretty typically, you'll find a handful of farms, let's say, who will try your technology on a pilot basis, like a non-paid basis. And in order to give you feedback, you'll be able to try different variations if you have a few different types of products, and hopefully you're choosing trial farms that could eventually become paying customers. One technique or one strategy I've seen a number of startups doing is going for what they call influencer farmers, right? So these are either quite large farms that maybe manage a big acreage or multiple farms in different areas, or they just happen to be a prominent farmer in their community. So if they adopt, then you know that your product will be used on either lots of acreage or the word will get out and other farmers will use that same technology. So that's one strategy in particular.
I'd just like to chime in too. Like, I think if you're asking a farmer to try a new technology, to give up land that maybe would be in production for something else, pay them for their service, right? Pay them to participate, value their time, value their land, and value their input.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, this sort of a free trial, if this product that you're developing has a return for the farmer, you know, increases yields, increases profits, reduces costs, you're effectively paying them by, you know, giving them this sort of free trial. So that's another way to look at it.
That's great advice. Thank you. Bethany, this next one's for you. It is, are there new crops that farmers in New York are able to reliably grow as a result of shifts in weather patterns?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously we're all seeing some season extension, right? We had a pretty warm October, and we do recognize that there needs to be more seed trialing and more understanding of what will continue to be the shift in New York State. I haven't heard of something specifically that is the silver bullet, like grow this next. We've got enough, you know, growing degree days to make this thing happen, and it's going to earn you a lot of money, but we definitely recognize that there are changes afoot, and we need to make sure that we have new markets for those products and also the ability to learn and grow.
And just to add on to that answer, as the growing season is longer and the non-growing season gets shorter, the window of planting cover crops is getting larger and larger, and that's something that extensionists all over the state and really all over the Northeast are talking about. So it wasn't too long ago that many farmers would say, okay, if I can't get my crop off in time to plant a cover crop, I've kind of lost that window, and that was a typical situation. But now you see farmers effectively planting a rye or a wheat cover crop, after Halloween, even into November, and still getting good growth before winter sets in, and all the benefits into spring that you want to get with a cover crop. So I would say, big picture, those sort of winter cover crops are gaining traction, and they're more available to farmers.
And kind of on the flip side of that, like as we're looking at a longer season, we're also not seeing as long a period of kill. So making sure that we have innovations towards new way to manage disease and pests moving forward is going to be important as well.
Great, and we have one last question for you. Are there innovative technologies on the horizon or even traditional practices that are effective already that can help mitigate climate change to deal better with known issues like spring frost risk?
Boy, who wants to challenge spring frost? Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard of some like boom technology that's going to help with the spring frost, but it certainly is an issue that farmers are facing. Do you have anything?
No, that last part about the spring frost risk kind of confused me, because I think of that as like a apple and fruit grower thing. I'm not sure I have lots of good ideas for that. Certainly you see some farms that are having good experience diversifying by adding some greenhouse capacity. It allows them to extend their growing season, dramatically, add to the sorts of crops that they're growing. But that's not something that's going to reduce spring frost risk. There's certainly breeders that are coming up with tree crops that flower at different times that are not as vulnerable. But getting to the first part of the question in terms of like traditional practices that can be helpful, there certainly are. It's not all about new technology, and thinking more about what on-farm inputs you can use as opposed to purchased inputs will also go a long way to reducing your climate vulnerability. So, for dairies, using manure more widely instead of buying fertilizer, thinking about how you can make the most use of your farm-grown feed as opposed to bringing in feed. I mean, these are all ways of reducing your costs and reducing your vulnerability to other supply chains. So I think there's a lot to be said for those sorts of innovations. And getting back to the ideas about agroforestry and how to work that into more farm landscapes, very often this company Propagate, when they analyze a farm, they'll often find land that's not currently being farmed. It might be wet, or it might be sort of a semi-wild area where they can more effectively manage the trees and actually turn it into a productive crop. So, thinking more traditionally, it's not a lot of new tech, but it's just thinking about a different way to manage the landscape.
Yeah, and I would just like to reiterate the point on diversifying, right? When you have a larger plethora of things you're doing, while it is more to manage, it definitely reduces your risk. So certainly that's something to be noted as well.
That's really great insight. Thank you.
And I would say one other point for startups that are here in this room and beyond is that you do see more and more investors, not just food and ag investors, but all sorts of investors who are thinking about impact, who are thinking about ESG metrics, environment, social, and governance, good governance metrics. And if your product, if your service checks these boxes in terms of having a positive impact, whether it's social or ecological, that goes a long way to getting your foot in the door. There are certain investors who will pass immediately if they don't see an impact. The funds that I work with, we consider ourselves impact funds. If we can't make a strong impact argument around a company, we won't continue looking at that company and pursue it further. So for the entrepreneurs out there, I would say keep in mind what is your impact story, and don't be frightened to make that front and center.
Yeah, and I would just like to remind folks that, right, on the landscape of agriculture, New York State is smaller scale agriculture, right? So even our large farms are not the size of the Midwest and West. And so when you're innovating, thinking about scalability again and that accessibility point, because you can make a very large impact in New York State if you have products that can be scaled to size for smaller farms as well.
Well, thanks for the conversation, Bethany.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Bethany and to Brian. There are grave pressures on New York's farming community, and there was a lot of great advice in there for startups who are wanting to engage in developing solutions. So thank you very, very much. And thank you, folks who have stayed through our last session today. What's up next is the Founders and Funders event, which is downstairs, starting in just a couple of moments. That's a celebration of Launch New York's 10 years of successfully helping to support the innovation ecosystem and startups here in Western and upstate New York. Before we close out the day, I want to say thank you. We couldn't have put this summit together without our colleagues at Cornell University, Empire State Development, the thoughtful input of the Regional Economic Development Councils for Central New York, the Finger Lakes, and the Southern Tier, and our partner group of industry and research leaders. And we're especially grateful for the support of this year's sponsors, Farm Credit East, Rabobank, Wegmans, and Upstate Venture Connect. Don't forget to vote for the Audience Choice Award at grow-ny.com. You have until tomorrow to vote for your favorite startup pitching over these 2 days. And join us for the virtual awards presentation, which will broadcast Thursday morning at 9:30 on grownewyork.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow for another exhilarating day of important ideas and engaging conversation. And again, join us downstairs if you're here in person for a convening of the Upstate Innovation Community. Thanks so much and have a great evening.